In the heart of Africa, where hunger and despair have long overshadowed dreams, one man dared to imagine the impossible. Burkina Faso, a nation scarred by poverty, betrayal, and endless pressure from the outside world. And yet, from the dust of suffering, a vision began to rise, a vision so bold, so unthinkable it would shake the world to its core. This is the story of Ibrahim Traoré and the $3 trillion African megacity that stunned the world. If you like the video, then like, share, and subscribe. The night sky over Ouagadougou was heavy with smoke. Not from war, not from revolution, but from the daily fires that poor families lit just to cook a single meal. The streets were quiet, too quiet, not because peace reigned, but because millions of people had learned to live in silence, numbed by poverty, numbed by hunger, numbed by the endless promise of change that never came. Children slept on cracked pavements under flickering neon signs, their stomachs hollow, their eyes half closed. Mothers carried water buckets for miles in the blistering heat, whispering prayers that tomorrow might bring something better. Fathers who once dreamed of careers worked odd jobs, building the futures of foreign nations instead of their own. Across Africa, the story was the same. Collapsing cities, broken roads, endless lines outside hospitals. Young men and women leaving their homes in desperate waves, not because they wanted to, but because staying meant dying slowly. Hope was a currency long spent, and yet, in the middle of this despair, one man dared to imagine the impossible. One man who refused to bow his head to the reality the world had dictated for Africa. His name was Ibrahim Traoré. The world called him naive. They called him reckless. Some called him insane. But in a single moment, a moment that began in silence and ended in thunder, he revealed a vision so staggering, so audacious, that the laughter of skeptics turned to gasps of disbelief. This was not a coup. This was not a battle. This was something far more dangerous. A dream, and the dream was this: a $3 trillion megacity, rising from the dust of the Sahel, a city that would not only redefine Burkina Faso, but challenge the balance of the entire world. The announcement shook nations, startled global bankers, and sent shockwaves through the halls of power. And yet, behind the headlines and flashing cameras, lay a story of struggle, sacrifice, and relentless defiance. A story of a leader standing against the weight of history itself. This was the day Africa rose, and what Traoré did next stunned the world. Ibrahim Traoré's journey toward this impossible vision did not begin with wealth, nor with luxury. It began with hunger. Born into a land scorched by heat and torn by instability, he grew up watching his people work the soil with their bare hands, only to be told that their gold, their cotton, their very future belonged to others. His childhood was marked not by abundance but by absence. Absence of food, absence of opportunity, absence of choice. Like millions of African children, he walked miles to school, a school without books, without desks, often without teachers. And yet inside him grew a quiet rage, a conviction that life could not possibly be limited to this cycle of poverty, that the story of Africa had been hijacked and needed to be rewritten. By the time he wore the uniform of a soldier, he had learned discipline, endurance, and resilience. But what he carried most was not a weapon, nor the authority of rank. What he carried was vision. The world saw him as a transitional figure, a temporary name on the long, bloody list of African leaders who rose and fell under the weight of power. But Traoré was different. He refused to believe that Africa's destiny was to beg at the feet of global institutions, forever chained to debt and dependency. He remembered the words of Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary whose ghost still haunted the soil of Burkina Faso. We must dare to invent the future. And so, he dared. But invention did not come in whispers. It came with thunder. In the year when Burkina Faso was crumbling under sanctions, when the world wrote off the nation as failed, when thousands fled across borders for survival, Traoré unveiled something unthinkable, a city of the future built by Africa for Africa. This was not just another capital city. This was not just glass towers and highways. This was a mega project larger than anything Africa had ever attempted, a sprawling metropolis powered entirely by renewable energy, its streets filled with solar trains, its neighborhoods designed around green spaces, its economy driven by African innovation and industry. It was not just about buildings. It was about breaking chains, but the price tag was staggering. $3 trillion, a number so vast, so unbelievable, that even his closest allies stared in silence. Economists declared it impossible. Burkina Faso doesn't even have the GDP to imagine such a project, they scoffed. Western journalists mocked him. A desert dream, they wrote, madness in the Sahel. But Traoré's eyes did not waver, because this was not only about Burkina Faso, it was about Africa itself. For decades, Africa's story had been written by others, international lenders, multinational corporations, former colonial masters. Every attempt to rise was met with sabotage, loans that enslaved nations, trade deals that stripped resources, wars that mysteriously found funding when leaders dared to resist. But Traoré's megacity was not just a construction project. It was a declaration of war against dependency. Why must our brightest minds leave our continent to succeed, he asked. Why must our children cross oceans to find dignity? Why must our future be outsourced to others? His vision was simple in its madness. If Africa built its own future, if it created its own Dubai, its own Shanghai, its own Singapore, but one born of African soil, powered by African hands, then no one could ever again say that Africa was incapable of greatness. Still, the obstacles were titanic. Where would the money come from? Where would the engineers, the architects, the urban planners be found? How could a nation burdened with poverty and insurgency even dream of constructing a city that rivaled the greatest in the world? And yet, beneath the doubt, something began to stir. Across the continent, young Africans, engineers, designers, entrepreneurs, heard his words and felt something they had never felt before: the call of home. Some began to write letters. Others began to return. From Europe, from America, from Asia, the sons and daughters of Africa began to look back toward a land that had long driven them away. Still, the laughter of the world grew louder. Foreign think tanks declared the project a farce. Headlines dripped with mockery. Traoré's African Atlantis, a $3 trillion mirage. But even as they laughed, construction sites began to buzz. Bulldozers roared. Foundations were laid. Engineers unrolled blueprints that looked less like fantasy and more like inevitability. And in that moment, the world realized something terrifying. This was not a dream. This was happening. What began as a whisper in the dust of Ouagadougou was about to grow into a storm that could shake the entire globe. And for Ibrahim Traoré, there was no turning back. The announcement of the $3 trillion megacity rippled across the globe like an earthquake. For some, it was a headline to mock. For others, it was a threat too dangerous to ignore. In Washington, officials laughed in closed rooms. Burkina Faso? They can't even keep the lights on. In Paris, financial analysts smirked over their coffee. $3 trillion? They don't even have $3 billion. In London, whispers spread through corporate boardrooms. If this city is built, if it works, Africa will no longer need us. But beneath the ridicule lay fear. Real fear. Because what Ibrahim Traoré had unveiled was not just a dream of steel and glass. It was the possibility of a free Africa. And for those who had grown rich off African poverty, that was unacceptable. The IMF issued a statement within days. Behind its calm language was a warning, almost a threat. Burkina Faso must remain fiscally responsible. Reckless projects will endanger economic stability. But the true message was clear: abandon this madness or face consequences. Sanctions were whispered. Credit ratings were slashed. International banks quietly blacklisted Burkina Faso, cutting off access to loans. Even aid, the lifeline that had kept millions alive, slowed to a trickle. For the ordinary people, this was no abstract battle. Prices of food doubled, fuel became scarce, hospitals struggled with shortages, mothers lined up outside bakeries, only to find empty shelves. Children fainted in classrooms from hunger, and so the whispers began. This project is killing us. Why waste money on a city when we can't even eat? Traoré dreams while we starve. The pressure was unbearable. 3 of his advisors resigned. Foreign ambassadors urged him to scale back, to be realistic. Some of his own ministers accused him of gambling with the nation's survival. But Traoré did not flinch. He stood before his people, his voice carrying not the arrogance of a dictator, but the steel of a man who had chosen a road with no return. "We are not starving because of the city," he declared. "We are starving because we have been chained. And this city is the key that will break those chains." Still, doubt was everywhere. The construction sites faced sabotage. Machines broke down mysteriously. Containers of imported steel vanished in transit. Foreign contractors pulled out overnight. Workers received bribes to abandon their posts. Shadowy groups whispered that the project was cursed. And yet, in the middle of this storm, something extraordinary began to happen. Across Africa, a quiet movement was rising. A young engineer in Nairobi quit his job with a European firm and boarded a plane to Ouagadougou. A team of architects from Lagos sent blueprints, offering to design entire districts for free. In Dakar, university students held fundraisers chanting, "If the world won't build our future, we will." Burkina Faso's airports filled with men and women carrying nothing but laptops, toolkits, and fire in their eyes. They were not coming for money. They were coming for history. Traoré watched as the first roads were carved into the desert sands. As bulldozers pushed through barren earth, as skeletal frames of buildings began to rise against the horizon. But for every step forward, there were 10 battles to fight. The IMF announced new restrictions. Foreign companies raised the price of cement, steel, and fuel. Even neighboring governments under pressure distanced themselves from the project. In some cities, protests erupted, food before dreams. At night, Traoré sat alone in his study, maps and blueprints spread before him. The numbers did not add up. The funds were insufficient, the risks astronomical, the people restless, and yet every morning he returned to the construction sites, boots in the dust, shoulders squared. He walked among workers who earned barely enough to eat, men who hammered steel with blistered hands, women who carried bricks under the blazing sun. They looked at him not as a savior, not as a hero, but as a man who refused to leave them behind. And it was in those moments, as he saw mothers building foundations for a city their children might live in, as he saw students coding apps on broken laptops in makeshift tents, as he saw farmers hauling water to keep construction alive, that Traoré understood the truth. This was no longer his vision. It was theirs. The world still mocked. Headlines sneered. Analysts called it an economic suicide. Corporations plotted. Banks tightened their grip. But in the dust of the Sahel, under the burning sun, the first skeleton of Africa's boldest dream was rising. The people were hungry. The workers were exhausted. The leaders were under siege. But the city was alive. And as the steel beams reached toward the sky, so too did the question that haunted every boardroom, every parliament, every palace across the globe. What if he succeeds? The desert winds howled across the plains, carrying with them centuries of dust, centuries of silence. For generations, the Sahel had been spoken of as a place of scarcity, barren, lifeless, forgotten. But now, in the heart of that same wilderness, something rose against the horizon. Something so colossal, so defiant, that it made the world stop and stare. A tower. Not just any tower, but a monolith of steel and glass taller than anything the region had ever known. Its design was unlike the sterile skyscrapers of New York or Dubai. This was an African tower, its frame curved like the ancient masks of the Mossi, its crown shaped to echo the rising sun of the Sahel. It was not just architecture. It was identity, carved in steel. The world's laughter began to falter. News helicopters circled above. Drones streamed footage to millions around the globe. A once empty desert now throbbed with energy, cranes lifting, trucks hauling, workers swarming like ants across a landscape of scaffolding and fire. For the first time, the impossible looked real. Still, the cost of progress was staggering. Families continued to endure hunger. Some villages remained without clean water. Critics fumed. This tower is a monument to vanity built on the bones of the starving. Foreign commentators sneered. It will never be finished. They will run out of money. They always do, but in Ouagadougou, when the tower's shadow fell across the earth, thousands gathered. Mothers carried their children to see it. Elders touched the steel with trembling hands. Students sat in circles sketching its form into notebooks. And when the sun set, casting the tower in gold, a chant rose from the crowd. Africa is rising. It was not just a building. It was proof. And proof was dangerous. Across the globe, nervous voices filled conference rooms. The IMF's warnings grew sharper. Burkina Faso's project is destabilizing the region. Corporations demanded new trade restrictions. A quiet coalition formed to suffocate the project before it became unstoppable. Power grids were mysteriously sabotaged. Shipments of materials vanished at sea. Rumors spread of corruption and mismanagement. The goal was simple: break morale. Kill the dream before it could breathe. But the dream refused to die, because the tower was only the beginning. Within months, a solar farm the size of a city rose from the sand, feeding power into the grid, lighting thousands of homes for the first time. Clean water plants hummed to life, sending rivers of hope into villages long forgotten. Roads unfurled across the desert like veins, connecting farmers to markets, children to schools, patients to hospitals. Piece by piece, district by district, the megacity began to take shape, and with it, the tide began to turn. African nations, once skeptical, started sending delegations. Leaders from Ghana, Senegal, and Rwanda walked the dusty construction grounds, their eyes wide, their hearts torn between disbelief and inspiration. Some mocked in public but whispered in private. If Traoré succeeds, we must follow. Meanwhile, the youth of Africa flooded social media with images of the rising city. Hashtags spread like wildfire. Africa builds. Sahel City. Future is here. For the first time in decades, Africa's story was not about famine, not about war, not about aid, but about creation. Still, the struggle was brutal. Workers collapsed from exhaustion. Families rationed bread while watching billion-dollar machines roar across the desert. Some accused Traoré of betrayal, of caring more for monuments than mouths. Protests flared, enemies circled. And yet, through it all, the construction did not stop, because something deeper than politics was at work, something older than money. It was the spirit of a people who had been told for centuries that they could not, standing tall and saying, "Watch us." The climax came on a blistering afternoon, under a sky so bright it seemed to burn. Traoré climbed a makeshift stage at the base of the tower, surrounded by thousands of workers in dust-stained uniforms. Cameras from every continent broadcasted the moment live. He stood there, his uniform damp with sweat, his voice steady, unshaken by months of sabotage and scorn. They said, "We could not build. Look behind me." The crowd erupted. They said Africa would never rise. Look at the horizon. Cheers thundered, rolling across the desert like a storm. This city is not mine. It is not Burkina Faso's alone. It belongs to every child of Africa who was told they were nothing. It belongs to every farmer, every mother, every student, every worker who refused to give up. This city is proof that we can build, that we can rise, that we do not need permission to dream. The tower gleamed behind him, its steel catching, the light like fire. And today, he declared, the world sees us. The crowd roared. Tears streamed down faces worn by dust and hunger. Workers lifted their tools into the air. Children waved flags of green, gold, and red. And across the globe, the reaction was electric. Stock markets trembled. Newspapers ran with headlines: Africa's future rising in the desert. Traoré defies the impossible. A city to challenge the world order. In glass towers from New York to Beijing, men in suits leaned forward, their laughter silenced. They did not say it aloud, but they all knew the truth. This was no longer a dream. This was a challenge, and the challenge was clear. If Africa could build this city, then Africa could build anything. For the first time in centuries, the balance of power felt uncertain, and as night fell over the Sahel, the tower lit up, thousands of lights piercing the darkness, visible for miles, shining like a beacon to the world. In that moment, the laughter ended, and history shifted. The lights of the tower glowed like fire against the night sky, casting long beams across the desert sands. For the first time, the Sahel, once synonymous with famine, with drought, with despair, had become a symbol of possibility. The images flooded television screens and smartphones across the globe. In living rooms from Lagos to Los Angeles, in cafes from Nairobi to New Delhi, people whispered the same words. Africa is rising, but the road ahead was not easy. The morning after Traoré's speech, the backlash came. The IMF released a scathing report warning of catastrophic debt and instability. Foreign media doubled down, labeling the project unsustainable vanity. Corporations lobbied governments to impose trade restrictions. Aid agencies cautioned that the mega city was a misplaced priority. And yet, none of it mattered anymore, because the world had seen the tower, and the people had seen themselves. A ripple across Africa. In Ghana, students marched through Accra's streets holding banners that read, "If Burkina Faso can, so can we?" In Nigeria, young entrepreneurs began pitching city-scale projects of their own. In Senegal, farmers donated part of their harvest to workers in the Sahel, declaring, "We are building this city together." For the first time in decades, Africa was not waiting for permission. It was daring. Delegations poured into Ouagadougou. Presidents, ministers, and business leaders from across the continent walked through the dust of construction sites, stepping around rebar and scaffolding, wiping sweat from their brows. What they saw was not a mirage, not a PowerPoint dream, but reality. Solar farms humming, roads stretching, water plants flowing, skyscrapers climbing. And slowly they began to whisper a different tune. Perhaps we can invest. The return of the exiles. From across the world, the African diaspora began to come home. Doctors in Europe packed their clinics and flew back. Engineers from the Gulf left high-paying jobs to join the construction effort. Young programmers abandoned Silicon Valley cubicles to build startups in the desert. They came not for riches, but for history. Airports overflowed with arrivals carrying laptops, toolkits, and dreams. Entire flights were filled with nothing but Africans returning, their voices buzzing with excitement. For every new tower that rose, for every train line laid, another family chose to come home. And with them came knowledge, technology, and innovation. The megacity was no longer just Burkina Faso's project. It had become Africa's project. The IMF cracks at first. The financial powers doubled their efforts. Loans were withheld. Trade routes disrupted. Corporations sabotaged supply chains. They believed they could starve the dream out of existence. But then, the unthinkable happened. Private African investors began pooling money. Crowdfunding campaigns raised millions. Cooperative unions of farmers and workers pledged their savings to the city's expansion. Even small street vendors donated coins saying, "This is for my children." Soon global investors who once mocked began to shift. First cautiously, then eagerly. Banks in Asia offered partnerships. Middle Eastern sovereign funds pledged billions. South American leaders spoke of joint ventures. The IMF's grip weakened, and for the first time in modern history, Africa looked at the world and said, "We will build without you." The city lives years passed. Dust gave way to glass. Sand gave way to green. The megacity rose like a miracle, a network of shining skyscrapers shaped in African motifs, solar trains gliding silently across tracks, clean water fountains bubbling in once barren plazas. Children who once studied under trees now filled digital classrooms powered by solar grids. Farmers who once struggled to sell crops now transported produce directly to futuristic markets. Hospitals gleamed with advanced technology, run by doctors who had once fled the continent but had now returned. It was not perfect. The struggles were immense. Corruption still lurked, resources still strained, and some districts remained half-finished. But the essence of the project was undeniable. Africa had done what the world said it could not. The mega-city was alive. A symbol beyond walls, but the true power of the project was not in its buildings. It was in what it symbolized. For centuries, Africa had been defined by others as a continent of need, of aid, of crisis. But now, when children in the West studied geography, they no longer saw Africa as a place to pity. They saw it as a place to admire. A new generation of Africans grew up believing not in exile, but in belonging. They wore shirts with the tower's silhouette printed on them. They spoke of becoming architects, engineers, doctors, innovators, not abroad, but at home. The megacity had redefined possibility, the global shift. The world could no longer ignore it. Trade routes shifted. Tech companies relocated headquarters to the Sahel. International students applied to African universities. For the first time, Africa was not just catching up, it was leading. Western headlines changed. The same newspapers that once mocked now declared, Africa's megacity, the future of global innovation. From dust to destiny. Burkina Faso's triumph. The world's newest economic superpower emerges. For Traoré, it was not vindication, it was responsibility. He knew the project was bigger than himself, bigger than Burkina Faso. He knew it was fragile and that enemies would always wait in the shadows. But he also knew one unshakable truth. Once the people had seen their own strength, nothing could chain them again. The final image on the 10th anniversary of the city's unveiling. Millions gathered in the great plaza at its heart. The skyscrapers glittered in the sun, their glass reflecting a continent that had chosen to rise. Trains hummed in the distance. Children laughed as fountains sprayed arcs of clean water. Traoré, older now, his hair touched with gray, stood at the same podium where he had once spoken to a dusty crowd of workers. His voice, though softer, carried the same steel. They told us this was impossible. They told us to wait, to beg, to remain small. But we chose to believe in ourselves. And, now look, he gestured to the city around him. The crowd erupted, their cheers rolling across the skyline like thunder. And in that moment, as the camera lenses of the world focused on him, as millions watched from every corner of the earth, his words cut through history. This is not the end. This is the beginning. And I ask you now, is this the moment Africa broke its chains? The roar that followed shook the ground itself, and the tower behind him, bathed in golden sunlight, stood as the answer.